Carla Morcello, eu sou professora da Universidade de São Paulo, na área de gestão ambiental. E eu queria agradecer o convite para apresentar a professora Heidi Ballard. E pelo convite para estar aqui, na verdade, o convite fui eu que me convidei, então, por eles terem aceitado o meu autoconvite para vir para esse encontro, que é ótimo, certo? Eu vou apresentar agora a professora Heidi Ballard. Ela é professora, eu tenho que trocar o óculos, aí começa. Ela é professora, hoje em dia, yes, I have to use two glasses, não? A professora Heidi Ballard, ela tem uma formação também eclética, como vários das pessoas que estão aqui. Ela fez o bacharelado dela em Biologia Humana e Literatura Inglesa, ao mesmo tempo, nos Estados Unidos. Fez um mestrado na área de educação e depois outro mestrado na área de ensino em Botânica, certo? E depois o doutorado dela é na área de Ciência Ambiental, Política e Gestão, na Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley, tá? No campus de Berkeley. Ela fez, depois disso, ela fez mais do que um pós-doutorado, fez um pós-doutorado na Colorado State University, outro na Oberlin College, e hoje em dia ela é professora associada, né, de ciência ambiental, mas na área de educação, na escola de educação, ou seja, ela está na área ambiental, mas com foco em educação. Tá? E, talvez, mais importante do que isso, ela fundou, né, e é diretora desse centro de ciência comunitária ou de ciência cidadã dentro da escola dela, né, que eu acho que, na minha opinião, é uma das coisas mais importantes. Tá bom? O que a professora Heidi vai falar, né, é como engajar o público em pesquisa científica e no monitoramento, certo? No monitoramento que pode ser na área ambiental ou na área ecológica, mas que também é aplicado em outras áreas, como de saúde, pobreza, né, na área ambiental. Em diferentes formas, tanto na coleta de dados como na categorização ou classificação, né, que é usado algumas vezes na área de sistemática, por exemplo, certo? E, principalmente, projetos de ciência cidadã, que eles mundial nos últimos anos, no Brasil também, mas que são uma prática antiga em alguns locais do mundo, como nos Estados Unidos e na Inglaterra, por exemplo, com observadores de aves, mas não só, né, observadores de borboleta e tudo mais. A gente já tem, segundo ela, né, um conhecimento bastante grande de como implementar esses projetos, e nos seus resultados, certo? Com os resultados tanto em termos, por exemplo, de monitoramento, a qualidade dos dados, os resultados em termos de conservação, um pouco menos como que isso pode impactar o bem-estar e o modo de vida de habitantes locais, por exemplo, quando um monitoramento comunitário. Tá? E ela vai falar principalmente disso, o que a gente já sabe, um resumo sobre isso, e ela vai usar um exemplo, né, de citizen science em ambientes costeiros e marinhos, que ela tem um livro publicado sobre isso, que a gente estava até conversando aqui, e a diferença de monitoramento com os jovens, né, particularmente os jovens, com adultos e as características dessas duas formas de monitoramento. Tá? Queria dar a palavra para ela e agradecer muito a presença dela em nome de todo mundo.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to my hosts for having me here. I'm so appreciative of the chance to get to talk with you all and share a little bit about what I've been learning. And to also Dr. Marcello, thank you very much, and for moderating later our exciting discussion that we will have. And I'm going to stand just because I kind of like to move while I talk, and it's probably better to keep awake, everyone. I've been really appreciative of my fellow discussers, my fellow speakers. I'm going to try. I feel very lucky that I get to speak after several people, because then I can try to make those links, as Mark did earlier with the previous day, setting the stage. So I am going to begin with an overview. And actually the introduction, the sort of thinking about community and citizen science, which I will define and give many examples, so that will be a term everyone is familiar with later if you aren't already. is a model and approach for 21st century science. If we think about 21st century science as being much more focused on transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity and solving the wicked problems of society and the environment, this is one approach. So I'm going to sort of present it as a concrete example and method and approach to trying to achieve many of those same goals. Then I'm going to focus in on my particular research, which is about how do you involve the public in scientific research? What does that really look like? And then even further on my particular research area, which is on the learning outcomes, what people learn by participating in these projects. And learning can be defined in many ways, and so I will talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about the case in particular of coastal and marine citizen science, citizen science for marine and coastal conservation, which I had the opportunity to edit a book with my colleague, Dr. Sigliano, with many cases. So get to draw some lessons. It is the marine and coastal sciences context, but I mean, I've been doing this long enough. I know the lessons can apply to terrestrial contexts as well. So hopefully useful for everyone. And then I have some thoughts about, because I have formed a center at my own university, some ideas about, I've been thinking a lot over the last 10 years about what the role of the university can be to facilitate more public engagement and community interactions and addressing the public good that universities are supposed to do with this kind of approach. So I will talk about that. And also like the down and dirty, if you are a scientist and you want to do a project like this, what are some lessons and recommendations and resources for being able to do that. So first, what is community and citizen science as I define it, and as many talk about the ways that other people define it, and how it addresses this sort of 21st century science needs, and thinking about how it bridges the gap between universities and the public. So we have these wicked environmental problems, things like the impacts of climate change, widening economic disparities, biodiversity loss, all of these many, many problems that actually require not just big data, but also large spatial data sets, large temporal data sets, as well as community or public buy-in, changes in behavior, changes in policy and actions that people take. So if we take as the premise that a core function of universities should be working to solve societal problems, which I think in this symposium we have sort of agreed on, at least the ones with the microphones have agreed that is what we're here for in many ways. Then this may be, community and citizen science may be a way of enacting or embodying this transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, if you think about doing science with society rather than doing science for society, if you think about the goal is mutual learning, not a one-way transmission of knowledge, and if problems must be solved interdisciplinarily because that is what we're confronted with. I think you also are experiencing here in Brazil, definitely we are experiencing it in the United States, that there is a broad distrust of science, and many people don't understand how science is done, who scientists are, what that process even looks like. And so then when things are in the news or recommendations get made, people don't trust it. So we talk a lot about improving or increasing scientific literacy, just people understanding science better for their daily lives. We can also talk about environmental literacy, in particular with these environmental problems. So one way to approach it is with, some of these problems is with citizen science or community science, and I will talk about the differences. But this is a map you may have seen, you may have heard of eBird. If not, it's awesome. It's a, nobody laughed. It's awesome. So it's, I don't know the translation for awesome, that's probably the problem. this is a heat map, right? This is showing the occurrence of the savanna sparrow. So eBird is a citizen science project that crowdsources, as Dr. Morcello said, bird watchers, people that are watching birds and can identify them all over the world, all over the United States in this case, and they enter that data, that the birds they have seen and where they have seen them and when, and these are the kinds of models and maps that can be generated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But the data is also used by researchers all over the world. It's freely accessible online. You can download any of the data sets that they have for all of the bird species I think you can imagine. And so, but the only way that they could get this data was by people making observations out in the world, on the ground, themselves. In this case, these are 9-year-olds, 4th graders in California who are using field guides like a book, but also an app that is called Merlin Bird ID, that helps, asks very simple questions and shows silhouettes of birds, and asks for the colors that are in the bird, and can tell you how to identify the bird that you're seeing based on the occurrence data from eBird. It accesses that information about what birds should be in your place at that time, and so offers you some identification options. And so 9-year-olds can identify the birds and enter the data, and that becomes part of the map. So this is a case study, one of the case study projects that I worked with. So going back historically, this is just in the US. We can think about how, in this case, this is 150 years ago, Audubon Society started the Christmas bird count, where everyone went out on Christmas Day and collected data about the birds that they saw and wrote it on a piece of paper and mailed it, and that was data to figure out what's occurring on, I have no idea, but I'll just keep going. No? It's a battery thing. Okay. I'm going to wear out the batteries for sure. Submitting this data paper, now this has been 150 years later, and we have apps, we have platforms on the web, we have faster ways, but people can still submit the data on paper if they want to. So I think that's an important point, that this isn't, many people dwell on technology with this whole approach, citizen science, but the fact is there are many people that A, don't have access to the technology, or B, don't like it, or C, it's just not as useful. So, moving forward, I would like to acknowledge the board pensioners counting butterflies, Dr. Schultz. So other kinds of citizen science projects are, in fact, people counting butterflies. And we know that in the US and in Europe, a really large proportion of people that participate in these kinds of projects are white and older and middle class and well-educated. And it's basically a giant challenge for our field to make that not the case, right? To broaden participation, to involve more people in these kinds of projects. It's always been true for environmental education. If anybody works in conservation education, it's true in science education. So we have a lot of work to do, and most of my projects are trying to tackle this. But what's important about the older, well-educated, middle-class people is that they actually do have a lot of time and energy and wisdom to give, just like a lot of other people do. And so it's not so bad if they decide to contribute their time to science than to taking a cruise or playing bingo, right? So do you have bingo cards? Games in parlors? Yeah. So it's, they're contributing their time in a good way. So I feel like it's an important thing to acknowledge that. So, but the other side of this sort of spectrum of people participating in science, in scientific research and monitoring, is the long history, decades and decades of community-based participatory research in public health on things like occurrence of cancer rates and asthma rates and things like that, where a community has a question and brings in the scientists to help answer the question. Usually they want to prove that there is a problem, but the scientist adds the rigor and the protocols to investigate whether there is a problem. Usually there is. So, but it is important that they partner with the scientists. So it also draws on a long tradition of community-based natural resource management and monitoring in, of hunted wildlife in Africa, Eastern Africa, and in Thailand, and Southeast Asian community forestry projects, where communities are monitoring their protected forests for themselves and to show to the federal agencies what species are there that need to be protected. So it also includes things like farmer participatory research, which is quite popular, I think in some parts of South America as well as in Africa, where farmers investigate with agricultural scientists. They do on-farm studies, but it isn't just the scientists telling them what to study and what to ask and what to investigate, but experiments are grown from what the farmers actually need and want and are able to grow. So that's important. And then lastly, the environmental justice movement with air quality monitoring and water quality monitoring has a very strong participatory element with, again, communities sort of asking questions and saying, we see a problem here in our water, we bring in a scientist to help. So it's this long spectrum. So one of the ways for example, there's a large international sort of technical assistance program called Global Community Monitor, and they do bucket brigades. I don't know if anyone has heard of bucket brigades, but they monitor air quality with a very low-cost plastic bucket and plastic bags and a little vacuum pump that you can buy at a drugstore, and they can send those samples to the labs that participate in these programs and have the air sample analyzed immediately after a leak from a factory that is causing pollution, that the federal agency says, we don't believe that there was a leak because they don't get out there for several weeks after the leak. So these community-based organizations can capture that data immediately when the leak has happened and get evidence that there was a leak, and those factories are fined. Sometimes they are shut down. So that is a powerful tool for these communities that they didn't have before. So with all of these different kinds of participation, a lot of us have tried to figure out, are these all part of the same story, or are they different parts? Are they the same? Should they be considered very differently or all under the same umbrella? And so there's citizen science, there's community science, which is usually associated with that environmental justice, air and water quality monitoring. There's volunteer monitoring, which is a long history of water quality monitoring in the US and I believe in Europe. We tried to come up in 2009 with a term that didn't quite take, called public participation in scientific research. PPSR, PPSR, it doesn't work as an acronym at all. And so we backed off. But the idea was there. And including community-based participatory research. And so I and my colleagues have decided we want to call this community and citizen science. Community science and citizen science. That's how we're calling it. And so, but then you have to shorten it to community and citizen science, because there are many people that very much identify with the term citizen science that we want to include, those very sort of scientist-driven, data collection-oriented crowdsourcing projects, but then we also want to very much acknowledge the community science, which is much more community-driven and participating in many more parts of the scientific process. So we say scientific research that involves members of the public in one or more stages of the scientific process, but let me give you a little more than that. One of the things that's important is that it is contributing, it is creating new knowledge. So when Thanks, does that work? Yes, thank you. I'm not good with the microphone. I could just yell, but that would not help our translator. And so when I work with children, I mean, I do this work with children participating in these projects, and lots of people say, well, isn't this just like all the science labs that children do in classrooms? Isn't that just what you're talking about? And I say, no, 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 no. It's different. Sometimes there's very good inquiry lab science that children experience and teachers provide in classrooms. That is awesome. But it's not the same as participating in a scientific research project where the data goes somewhere else. The data is getting used by someone, either a basic researcher or a land manager or a local city council, and decisions are getting made, sometimes even maybe just the school campus. The administrators decide to plant new plants in the school because of what the data has suggested. So that's sort of the line that we draw. Okay, and so we have this large range of different projects. These are all photos from the case studies that I've studied with my team of kids doing citizen science, except for the reef check, that is an adult scuba diver. So we'll talk about the marine examples. But one thing I wanted to make sure, so what I have confronted is that there is a lot of need in the scientific community, in the education community, in the conservation community, the land management, natural resource management community, to try to figure out how to do this well. Everybody thinks that this is a silver, that this is a panacea, that this is going to solve all of our problems. The public will be engaged, science will get done well, decisions will get made better, local knowledge will be incorporated, and we will all sing and hold hands, right? And that's not, and so what we know is that some of this can be done badly. Sometimes people try these projects without thinking it all the way through, or sometimes very much thought it through, but the audience just doesn't come, or people just don't participate, or the data turns out to be terrible. So there's lots of ways that you can design these projects to maximize good data quality and good participation from people and great learning from those participants. So we decided that maybe we should start a center for that. So I got to start a center at UC Davis. And so, for example, we have this project, the Guardians project that's here, that's Dr. Viana and her colleagues are producing. I borrowed your icon, I used your logo. I hope that's okay. And I quoted from your poster. So these are not my words. And I just wanted to explain that there's this really good work going on here right now. We are all going to talk together about how to make sure that maybe you can collect data about the impacts on the children that you're working with, right? How to survey, how to interview, what kinds of questions can you ask to document that there's lots of learning happening. So that's the kind of thing that the folks and my center and I try to do. And I also wanted to highlight that in this case, this is about looking at pollinators and having members of the public collect data, submit photographs of pollinators, floral visitors, and submitting them to the project. And so I'm excited to learn and talk more. They have a poster on Thursday. Everyone come back. So the Center for Community and Citizen Science is right now a small team, but I'm going to talk some more at the end about sort of how we've structured things as as an institution within a university that can be a bridge and hopefully a conduit with members of the public, with teachers in schools, with community-based organizations, and with the scientists that are here at the university. Because they need, in my university, they are very excited about this idea, but they want help knowing how to do it. So we see ourselves as a boundary organization of bringing people together to do this work. So I will say that one of the things that we sort of did early on is think about the steps of the scientific process as a way to, we talk about typologies, but then so many typologies for this participatory science that it starts to boggle the mind. So, but this is one of the kinds of typologies that helps me think about it, where we break down the parts of the scientific process and we say, what if, in what ways are the volunteers or the members of the public involved? And so we came up with 3 sort of main categories that align with the ways a lot of other typologies in the research literature and natural resource management literature, public health literature, and we called them contributory, collaborative, and co-created. And to say that these are not mutually exclusive and that any given project could be in between, it's all blurry lines, but we talk about those contributory projects are the ones that are like the citizen science with the birds, right? The classic citizen science where members of the public are pretty much just collecting data and the scientist has the question and is driving most of the project and is going to disseminate those findings, analyze and disseminate the findings. And that's a large portion of the kinds of projects that are out there. The collaborative projects are those that where people maybe help a little bit with designing some of the methods because they're on the ground and have experiences with maybe the field more than the scientist does, or in complementary to the scientists that are leading the project, and then maybe help a little bit analyze the data. They don't really drive, collaboratively, sort of, let's say, in a co-leading way, drive the project. And then the co-created projects are the ones where it's very much a partnership between scientists and community members, and they ask the questions, they start with the question and go all the way through to disseminating the findings. So that's kind of how we broke it down. And as I said, it aligns very much with the sort of other research literature. If you're interested, the paper that really kind of provides all of the literature review basis for these categories and sort of the premise of citizen science and public participation in scientific research, it's the Shirk, Ballard et al. 2012 in Ecology and Society. And so that's kind of a good one. It's nice if you're interested in this and you want to write proposals about it, it's good to have some articles that you can refer to substantiate. So just briefly, examples of the contributory project are Project Feeder Watch, where people set up a bird feeder and then they watch what birds come to the feeder and they send that data via online platforms to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And people love watching their birds anyway in their backyard, and this lets them contribute some data. I know the scientists at this lab that discovered lots of people started in one area, started submitting data. They just wrote notes at the bottom of their submission that said, there's some gunk coming out of the bird's eyes, the house finches. This one species is some goo coming out of their eyes. I don't know what that is, but I thought you'd like to know, right? And it turned out it was house finch conjunctivitis, and they were able, using all of the data that everyone was submitting, they started asking people, please tell us if there's goo coming out of the house finch eyes, and they could do an entire epidemiology study with this disease spreading through the population. The Coast Project, people walk the beach and submit data about dead birds. People on the coast here make note, dead birds are totally interesting to some people. So you can walk the rack line, walk the line on the beach where all the stuff washes up, and there's a protocol where they basically do forensics. They measure if they've only got a wing, they write down information about the wing, and they can identify the species, and it helps the scientists at University of Washington understand climate change, understand seabird population changes due to climate change, and also due to fishing, bycatch, when birds are killed by fishing lines and nets as bycatch. Collaborative projects, but that's like they just submit the data. And I've done focus groups with these folks and interviews, and they don't want to do the analysis. They don't want to participate in any other parts of the project. They are very happy to walk the beach and collect that data and be a part of something bigger, but they don't feel like they have to be the scientist. Right? So I think that's important, because lots of people say, everyone will feel like a scientist. And it's actually some people just want to help with this part. So it's really okay. An example of collaborative project is my dissertation, a little bit about me. I did my dissertation on basically forest ecology and rural sociology. So I was in an interdisciplinary, see above yesterday's talks, right? I was in an interdisciplinary department at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. Environmental Science, Policy, and Management was the name of the department, which means like everything environmental, right? And so I had different professors on my committee, and I did forest ecology and rural sociology and participatory action research as my areas. And conservation biology to some extent. And so I worked with harvesters of a non-timber forest product, which I learned, I believe, by studying products in Brazil, remotely, by reading. And so I've always wanted to come here. And so this product is harvested for the floral greens industry, these leafy shrubs, and it's sold as bouquets for floral greens. This was at my friend's wedding, this photo. And the harvesters were mostly immigrants from Latin America, from Mexico and Honduras and Guatemala. And many of them were undocumented, but I don't know, I didn't ask. And the Forest Service, the US Federal Forest Agency, was giving permits for harvesters to harvest this product. And thousands of workers were out in the woods, but they really liked the job because they were their own boss. They could pick when they wanted to. It was money on the ground, right, to pick these plants and sell them wholesale sheds, at the buying sheds. And so, but then people were worried that maybe this plant was being over-harvested, and so they started to shut down these areas to harvest, but nobody had any research on it, and nobody actually talked to the harvesters. And so I said, can I go work with, can I see if this will work to actually do this work with the harvesters? And, the Forest Service people said, good luck, sweetheart. I don't know, sweetheart in Portuguese, but you know what I mean. They were skeptical. So I ended up doing a participatory research project with all these guys who knew the woods better than the Forest Service in most cases, and they knew exactly, we could look at the different harvest levels. Is this still working? Yeah. They looked at the different harvest levels. We studied, and they did the treatments on the site so that it was actually represented the way that it works. I never know if I'm doing this right. And about the way that they harvest. And we developed the methods together about what constituted commercial product, what was the commercial biomass versus the total biomass. And the data sheets were in Spanish, and we did it all together. And they formed an association, and we had a big dinner with lots of graphs on the table for people to interpret and help me understand whether the results that we saw reflective of their experience of the yields from year to year. And I gave the information to the Forest Service, and they said, thank you very much. And then 9/11 happened. The World Trade Center bombing happened. And so suddenly we developed crazy Homeland Security policies, and nobody wanted to work with the Forest Service anymore. So, but word to the wise, any students in the room, I wrote an article about that. It's a good one. So the ways that power and the political economy and social economy totally made it impossible for it to be a resilient system because of the sort of political climate at the time, regardless of how much the ecology worked. So, however, I will say that it was my dissertation, so I do not consider this co-created because they participated in every part of the process with me, but I was the one that had to decide at the end. So I did not totally share the decision-making power with those guys, right? I had to make the call at the end because it was my dissertation. So co-created projects are where you develop the projects completely as co-leaders from start to finish. There's examples of the tribe here on the left. This is a tribe in Oregon. Sorry, in the Willapa Mountains, working on, there's electrocuting fish so that they can stun them, not kill them, stun them, so they're just frozen, and then move them to a new riverbed, to a new river channel. And so this was a collaborative project with some NGOs and scientists in the area from Oregon State University. So they, and to work with tribes, it has to be a completely co-lead, shared decision-making across the board with the scientists. So an example of a co-created project is one in California, hopefully you can see, with primarily farm worker communities in the Central Valley of California, where we have lots of agriculture and lots of farm workers primarily from Mexico. And this mapping project, they used community mapping to be able to track and document the occurrence of pollution and air and water quality risks and lay it over with social vulnerability, poverty, and things like that. And it actually informed the regional California Environmental Protection Agency policies in the area about pesticide use and other pollution. So it really did make a difference. I'm gonna now move to just say, thinking about involving the public in science and the sort of focusing on the social and educational benefits and outcomes and how we can think about these three different sort of kinds of participatory science or community and citizen science. If you think about the contributory type, there's a lot of people participating, hundreds and thousands many times. I think that iNaturalist is now up to 1 million that I will talk about in a second. You have a greater spatial and temporal coverage of the data usually, and just more data, more records. But with moving towards the co-created side, you have fewer people, but often a much more intensive collaboration with the scientists, much more just interaction with scientists so we can understand what scientists are like and what they do and that they're people too. And engagement with the science process is more towards the co-created side. It's possible that because it's being driven by a very interested community asking questions that it can influence policy, but there's actually a lot of data on the contributory side that's also able to contribute to policy. And my work, I'm thinking about science learning and science identity, which I will talk about in just a second, and how people sort of identify with science and how they see themselves with respect to science. So another way that you could look at all these different kinds of projects is to, and this is just something to think about if you are doing one of these or if you intend to do one, is you can look at the sort of individual learning outcomes the individual person level, what is someone learning by participating in this project? You can, and sort of the classic science learning outcomes, like do they increase science knowledge? Do they increase in their understanding of process and skills of science? But you can also look at the programmatic outcomes, and then what I hope to do, I'm still working on it, is look at the community level outcomes. Like, does participating in these kinds of projects increase social capital in an area? Does it increase community capacity in an area? We have done research on, it does increase trust between the members of the public and scientists and members of the public and federal agencies, and in my case, the forest agencies. So these are some ways to kind of think about those outcomes that you could have from doing this kind of work. And another way to think about it is thinking about this is what I did with my youth-focused research, is looking at not only the science learning that people might gain by being a part of the project, but also do people's environmental actions, do people's behaviors towards the environment, environmental stewardship behaviors, does that change? And then also many people in the are particularly concerned with youth and civic engagement, and adults, but thinking about engaging with the civic life, engaging with politics or policies, engaging with management, just engaging in their community in any way to improve their communities. So we looked at all three of those with some of my youth research. So the claims that are made about community and citizen science and learning, can you see it when it's yellow? I hope so. Is that it'll increase scientific learning outcomes, but then the question is, under what circumstances? Not all of this produces magically science learning outcomes for participants, and not all in the same way. So people say it increases environmental learning and people will change and increase their stewardship behaviors. But what aspects, what kinds of actions, and under what circumstances, what causes that? And also people say that it'll ultimately provide access to science for people who do not get access to science, which is one of my main concerns. But the question is, who are we talking about? Are we talking about just the standard participants in these kinds of projects, or are we talking about urban communities of color, poor people, rural communities, who actually benefits from this extra access to science? So my research in particular is looking at how learning through these projects and through participation in real science actually might lead to people changing their actions or their intentions to act. And so I first focus, just as an important point, thinking about learning, I think about the goal of science learning as not people need to know more facts, right? Which is what a lot of testing and textbooks often focus on, at least in the United States. So we focus on science learning for people to take up science for themselves, to solve problems and improve their own communities and lives and the environment. This is drawn from social justice and participatory action research framing. It's science plus. And the idea that coming from the natural resources world and conservation world, that science has power. I know we talk about how sometimes it doesn't and sometimes it shouldn't, but often science has power, and so to give that to a group of people that are that don't have that voice or don't have that rigorous science sort of tool is really important. And one of the ways that we can see if this is happening for people is to look at identity, to think about if people that are participating in these projects see themselves as now having that power, if people see them as having that tool of science that they can go use and are thinking of ways they can go use this tool now. So that's why I actually focus on identity and agency. Individual agency and identity. So identity is the idea. Is there any education researchers, learning researchers here? No? Okay. So I'm going to go for it. So identity is one aspect that has been identified in science learning research, literature. Identity with science is a component of science learning outcomes. The idea that people might know about science, they might understand the processes of science, they might even have the skills of science, but if they don't identify with science, then it might not be very likely that they will go use it, right? They don't see themselves as using it as a tool. So identity is about how you see yourself and who you want to be and how you want to be perceived by others. It's if you see yourself as someone with science, if you see yourself as someone who identifies with science, if you see yourself as someone who understands or uses or does science, and it impacts what you decide to take up and how you interact in the world, especially as a young person, but also as an older person. How you approach problems, how you solve problems, how you approach your job and your family. So it can impact all those things. So one project that we got to do that was funded by the National Science Foundation was to study 6 different citizen science, community science projects. Basically, the 4 on the left are pretty much more contributory or collaborative, and then the last 2 are more the community science co-created projects. And so people checking their bird nests. That's a bird nest that people put up, and then they check to see when the baby birds hatch and all the stages of the life cycle for the birds. Monarch larva monitoring project, where they are looking at the butterfly larva and all the life stages. They have to actually know the life stages pretty carefully. The Hudson River eel project is glass eels, where you can hold like a handful of these little squirmy, transparent, sort of larval eels, and you have to count them. They make estimates. They do not go one at a time. And Cocoa, which is the collaborative rain, hail, and snow network, where they look at weather data, basically precipitation data, just checking the rain gauge. And then the co-created projects are ALARM is a water quality monitoring effort that has many, many sites around the east of the US, and Global Community Monitors that I told you about with air quality. So, did 230 interviews with about 70 people over 4 years across the 6 projects. And one of the things we were looking at was how they identify with science. And so we found first that lots of people who talk about this say, oh, do you think of yourself as a scientist, yes or no? Right? That is not the only way that people can identify with science. So we found many, many other aspects of science identity in these projects, and found that actually the majority of people don't, and specifically correct us that they do not see themselves as scientists, but they see themselves as doing science, they see themselves as contributing, and importantly as part of the scientific community. They see themselves as part of the community of practice. So they don't say we're scientists, but we're helping, right? We're a part of this whole community. Even people that just check their rain gauge for 5 minutes a day, right? So they feel like a part of something that way. The majority of participants saw themselves as people who understand science daily. What's important is that regardless of their citizen science participation, they felt this way. So that's evidence that these are people who already kind of identified with science. So we're not converting a lot of people potentially with these kinds of projects. They already were kind of science people, right? So that's why I say they're the choir, right? We're preaching to the choir. But what's important is that the added value of doing these projects was that they saw themselves as part of the science community and felt like they were contributing to something and could do something with that, right? And the reason this is the lesson for people trying to do this kind of work as a scientist is that it depended on whether they knew how the data was being used. So if they never heard back from the project leaders about how their data was getting used, or if anything was coming from it, then they checked out. They stopped caring. They didn't feel like they were a part of anything, and they didn't feel like basically a lot of people dropped out if they felt that way. But the projects that communicated back to the participants about how the data was being used had real stickiness. People definitely participated and continued. So I think just some other points about the science identity development was that it depended on if they had a background in science. The people that did not have a background previously in science were like transformed. Like we did see that if we had to graph it, it was qualitative data, so we didn't. But if we had to graph it, their sense of their abilities to do science, they felt like science people went way up. From having, they said, like, I speak to policymakers now about volatile organic compounds, and I didn't even know what that was before. So I feel very, that empowerment sort of factor really increased. And I'm also going to say that I've said the last point already. So with agency, so identity is sort of how you see yourself. But agency is what you see yourself being able to do, right? So agency is sort of acting on the world in personally consequential ways. So feeling like you can use science to act on the world around you, see yourself as a resource for your community, that's agency. So we also are really focusing on that because that's the kind of the way we think about people actually doing social justice work and doing environmental work as a consequence of participating in this science. So there's this idea, there's a sort of framework or construct called critical science agency that is sort of taking that critical theory approach to science learning, and it's the idea that people can use science to reflect on and act on injustice in their lives, and we basically adapted that and called it environmental science agency because we are thinking about how do people see themselves using environmental science to take social or environmental action in their lives. So what kind of agency do people feel after participating in community and citizen science? So it includes sort of 3 areas that we looked at. This is how we defined the outcomes that we care about from participation for individuals. So people understanding a deeper understanding of environmental science content and practice. They identify their own roles and their own identities and expertise in that science, and then they see themselves as using those experiences to take action in their lives, as a foundation for change. So the findings, let's see, how do I want to do this? So we looked at 10 case studies of just youth-focused community and citizen science. Projects around Northern California. We did a big scan of every project we find and then selected representative cases that kind of represented the range of in-school and out-of-school things that were associated with teachers and things that were associated with after-school programs or summer programs or family things on the weekends. We looked at the short-term one-day BioBlitz sort of phenomenon of people just going out and collecting data as an event at a park for a day with their families usually, and then the ongoing programs where they come back every week for a month or every week for a year. We looked at online participation and field-based participation. We looked at people using different kinds of tools, kids that got to use different kinds of tools. And we did pre-program interviews and post-program interviews and did observations of the focal kids all throughout the program. I had a lot of grad students doing this. This was interestingly funded not by the National Science Foundation, but by a private foundation that was very excited about environmental education for kids. So we looked at kids doing transects on the beach, monitoring for sand crabs. They had to shove a tube into the sand and then count how many sand crabs came out in that volume of sand. And they had to sex them and everything, which is very hard with a sand crab. There's the water quality monitoring and the East Bay Academy for Young Scientists. They did water quality monitoring in their creek. There was aerial mapping, balloon mapping. This is awesome. Public Lab, if you look it up, Public Lab has a whole kits that you can make from scratch or you can order online, but making them from scratch is easy. And you float a balloon, a big balloon with a camera hanging from it, and you can get digital photos. You have it on automatic, taking many, many, many photos in a few minutes, and you get a much higher resolution photo than Google Earth of what's exactly going on in a place at a particular time, and you can use this to map landscape change over time. You can map pollution. You can map lots of things. So high school kids doing that, little kids looking at pollinators on the upper right, monarchs, more pollinators, but specifically looking at phenological mismatch between the monarchs and the milkweed plant that is their host, and elementary school kids looking at the birds. What we found was that an example of when not all youth developed all 3 areas of environmental science agency in all the programs, but we looked at when did they, right? When did it happen? And so this is an example of Lynn, who took ownership over the data collection, basically, or data quality. She was she decided that not only was she just going to be able to do it, but she was going to be really good at it and was going to teach everyone else how to do it right. And she was the one who checked everyone else's samples to make sure that they were doing it right. And she taught the new people when they came on board about how to collect the samples correctly and analyze them. And she described how she took herself more seriously after presenting at the conference. Her grandmother said that she was changed and was thinking of becoming a science major when she went to college. She hadn't even really been thinking about college before that. So she also really saw herself as doing this water quality testing to see if they could help make the creek healthier. So she was in Oakland doing water quality monitoring. So we identified a few key practices that kids were going through, what was going on, what were they trying to do, or the processes that were happening when they actually did develop this environmental science agency. And we found that it was when they had to share their findings with outside audiences. So not just collecting the data, but having to explain the data to somebody else, not just their peers, but like the city council or some scientists or some other classes. But they were accountable. They felt like they really had to get it right. And same with the youth taking ownership of data quality. When they really felt like they were responsible for that data, that's when it really mattered and they learned that science. The science that we care about. And then also when they saw the interactions between the human systems and the ecological systems. So Lynn, when she was doing the water quality monitoring, they noticed that the water quality was really bad right down the stream from a homeless encampment. So there are a lot of homeless people camped on the creek, and they said, well, this is causing water quality problems, and look at the horrible conditions for these people. And so they presented to the city council that they should do something about the homeless problem, right? And that they had evidence to talk about that. So that was pretty powerful for them. And they also contributed in these projects directly to sort of the conservation outcomes like riparian restoration. They did water quality monitoring, and then they planted plants that were known to improve the quality of the water. They did the sand crab monitoring, and they did beach cleanup, right? Which seems kind of small potatoes, but when you couple the science with the stewardship, it was quite powerful for the kids, and it also was contributing to the landscape. FYI, if you're interested in working with kids in citizen science, we have a fantastic website. We did get some money, again, from this private foundation, to produce materials. This is something, thinking about this transdisciplinary work, I would say that when coming from the participatory research tradition, we basically can't just produce journal articles. Like, that's not as we've talked about, not the way that most people can get information and use it. And so we produce things like research briefs that are, one-pager digested versions of our findings that we give to teachers and educators, right? Like, here are the practices that we found work based on our research. This is what they look like. Here are case studies that show what it looks like. So these are the pieces that we got to. We also made some videos that have teachers and scientists talking together about these projects, and how you can do it too. So it's these sort of other outputs, other products that we hope are reaching practitioners, not just researchers. And also we made a web tool to look for projects and identify what kind of citizen science project you might want to do if you're a teacher or an educator. So that's like another product for practitioners. What's my time? I've lost track. Okay. Oh, no. Okay. Excellent. So, FYI, things happen at natural history museums. Next. No. I put this in here because I thought, it's okay. No, this is me being calm. You should see me excited. You don't want to be around. What we've done is moved this project to the next phase, which is working with natural history museums who have citizen science projects. And I bring it up because the taxonomy question came up, and there are, a lot of taxonomists at natural history museums. And so this project, these are all the citizen science project that the Natural History Museum in London has going or has had going. Some of them are finished because they answered the question. But one of the main things that they are really expanding is working with digitized collections. So how can people help transcribe digitized collections, and in some cases measure things on the photos of herbarium specimens, etc. And we're looking at youth participating in that. So we basically took the different programs, the ongoing monitoring programs, the short one-day BioBlitz programs that they have, and the online crowdsourcing digitized collections projects that they've got online, and we're looking at youth participating in those projects and what they learn through those projects. So we have 3 museums, the Natural History Museum in London, the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, across all 3 settings. It's crazy town. It's really, there's a lot of data happening here. But it's fantastic to be able to compare across settings, because people are wondering what are the costs and benefits and cons of doing the short term versus the long term, and the online versus in the field. So we're looking at all of those. So the next piece is about what I wanted to, sort of a key point is that it isn't just about the learning from the participants, by the participants. It's about the learning that can happen for scientists and people that are conducting these research projects and monitoring projects. And a lot of my work early on with the harvesters in Washington State was about what I and the Forest Service learned from the harvesters involving their local knowledge. Normally we think about indigenous knowledge. Here we think a lot about indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, but even those harvesters who had been in the country for 10 years had developed really intense local ecological knowledge. So these projects the learning can happen both directions. So I wanted to talk about the marine and coastal citizen science. I'll try to be more brief, and how that's an example of ways that scientists can make these projects successful for good data quality, good rigor in your projects, but also involve people in a really beneficial way. So these are all just a sample, probably now, of marine citizen science projects that are out there. There are many. You can monitor an amazing number of different kinds of things. And so I co-edited a book on 12 cases of these different projects to look at what were the conservation outcomes, really, what questions were answered, what management got changed due to the citizen science information that was collected, and how did people benefit or learn from being a part of the project, and mostly how did it get done? What are the nuts and bolts of really doing these projects well? So the range of projects include looking at mangroves in Kenya, people participating in the seabird tracking project, Coast, the marine litter projects, which are there are quite a few of them now, looking at marine litter on the beaches and submitting data about that, eelgrass monitoring, coral reef, and snorkeling and diving. So an example of one of those is the Queen Conch project, where they monitored my colleague John Sigliano studied both in the marine protected area and outside the marine protected area, and had tourists and local people together doing the snorkeling and diving and collecting data about the Queen Conch species, and seeing that there was an impact. He had been doing it before they set up the marine protected area, so they could actually measure the impact of the protection of this place. What do we got? Oh, I'm like living large. No, I'm just looking at everyone. It's late in the day. I haven't been doing any dancing. So wow, measured the impact of the protected area. Ta-da! So another example, another case that we used, that we looked at was the Coast project, as I mentioned. This project is very successful. About 800 volunteers now are working up along the coasts of Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California, Northern California. And so it's been acknowledged by the White House Champions of Change. That was when Obama was president. And so, when this, science was valued. And so we got a lot of lessons on how to do a good, high quality citizen science project from that case. And so what we looked at, as I said, is the conservation, particular context and questions they asked, the methods and quality control, quality assurance methods that they used, how participants were actually involved, and sort of the care, and she talks about the care and feeding of the volunteers. It's a thing, right? You can't just assume people are going to collect data for you. You have to think about what their interests are, what their motivations are, why they might be wanting to come help, and why they might want to stay. And then benefits and challenges. And so so one of the questions that was asked yesterday, I think, was how do you know when it is a good idea to do this kind of project? It doesn't fit everything. It doesn't fit every question or scientific topic that you could be studying. So we said when the data is needed over a wide spatial and or temporal scale, or it's in hard to reach areas that maybe only private citizens can get into, or you need lands, private beaches, but things that involve fishers or divers and snorkelers and ecotourists. And so that is one case or condition. And then when you need it to provide a baseline, when you're doing sort of this ongoing monitoring and need it to provide a baseline to look at when there are perturbations or change. And often it's really a good idea to do it when you can link it with on-the-ground stewardship. So involving local communities that actually are able to take some action pretty quickly with respect to the kind of science that you're doing. We also looked at what are the good audiences and stakeholders that can be involved, because that's kind of what you want to do, is start with people that are already interested in the thing that you're talking about. So using divers and snorkelers to study reefs makes a lot of sense. They're out there anyway. They went on purpose, often spending money to get there, right? So recreationists, also people who go to beaches for fun can also maybe collect a little data about marine debris while they're there. People are very happy to contribute for many people, if it doesn't take too much time, right? But sometimes people are very happy to contribute if they know that it really is needed, even if it does take a lot of time. fishers and other coastal resource users, and then the youth. Like, we had several cases where teachers and out-of-school educators are looking for ways to involve kids in science. And so if you can provide that, then they are very happy to have you collect data. But you have to make sure that the protocols that you provide are doable for that group of kids, right, for the age group that you're talking about. So they don't have to collect all your data. Maybe you have specific data that's very sensitive and requires a lot of specialized knowledge, but they could collect the easy stuff. So that's something we found. There were lots of strategies for ensuring data quality. The intensive in-person training is really effective, but you can also do things online with video instructions if that's a possibility for people to watch videos. But one of the ways that people are always worried about the data quality from citizen science and community science projects, but we always say you use the same methods that you use to ensure data quality in every other kind of science research, right? So how do you make sure that your technicians are collecting good data? How do you make sure that you yourself are collecting, replicable, valid, reliable data? So there use data verification procedures. There's supervision. There's providing feedback to improve their accuracy, and there's also, not in these projects, but in other citizen science projects, I know there are algorithms that kick back anomalous data. You can build that into your, and in fact, just spreadsheets that won't allow you to enter a crazy range data. So there's lots of ways to do it. Recruiting, retaining, and engaging participants. I know I even got that question today about how do you find people, right? Sometimes it's hard to find them, sometimes it's hard to keep them. And so one of the things is think about what their needs and interests and motivations are from the beginning and build that in. I worked with a pollinator monitoring project where the scientist was so driven to just make sure that people collected good data that in the training she didn't talk about why we care about bees. Why are bees good? She didn't talk about how bees have, she didn't talk about the life history of the bees, and the participants just wanted to know some basics, not just the data. They just wanted to know a little bit more about bees. So you have to think about those kinds of things. And the key is, we found over and over again, communicating how participants' data is used, how you're using their data to ask and answer questions makes a huge difference for people. And I'll tell you an example of that in a minute. Think about participant safety. Hopefully that's obvious. Thinking about technology and crowdsourcing. Smartphones are great, but you don't have to use tech. You have to think about the access that people might have to the technology. Lots of people think that, it's just about developing an app. I have a citizen science idea, I have to develop an app. But there are many, many, many projects already out there that you can use, which I will talk about in a second, like iNaturalist, where there are platforms that you can access and you don't have to develop the program and the platform yourself. Manage expectations, provide data stories. That's what Julia from the Dead Seabird Coast Project talks about, is just little blurbs that talk about how a chunk of the data helped us understand something better. And getting that back out to the participants really makes a difference. They stick around a lot longer. Building on local knowledge, and then always being ready to revise and improve your project. And so in the end, we found that connecting people to their place really matters, especially in the coastal and marine environments. That collaborating across partners, across sectors really was how all of these projects happened. So it's not just the scientists and the public, but many other, sometimes intermediary groups, NGOs and agencies, and then teachers and schools sometimes. And I think the last thing to say is that it's not a silver bullet, but it can be thoughtfully designed. A citizen science or a community science project can, if it's thoughtfully designed, can actually be really powerful. So to wrap up, what does this mean for people thinking about doing citizen science projects or community science projects, individuals and scientists in particular? And so I wanted to show you the two platforms that have become pretty, I want to say, universally useful for, depending on obviously the kind of research that you're doing. So the Zooniverse, has anybody heard of Zooniverse? It's a great platform. It's a website, you Google it, Zooniverse, and they've really made it accessible to create your own project where you're crowdsourcing people, you're crowdsourcing the world. So this is not about local engagement per se, but you're asking anyone online, there are millions of Zooniverse users that just love doing these projects, to classify and sometimes analyze, categorize photos or other pieces of data when you have a ton of it. And so, in this case, my colleague who studies sage grouse, and she's one of my best friends, and we were trying to figure out a way to work together for 15 years. And we finally figured it out when Zooniverse made their product better. This sage grouse is a ground nesting bird that has the big yellow esophageal sacs, and it goes around and makes noises and struts and does so she studies sexual selection. And so she watches the birds, her team, for like a couple of hours when they're out on the lek, the gathering place where all the mating displays happen. But the rest of the day they are not there, and they don't know what the ebb and flow of attendance at the site is by these birds. And so they set up camera traps, and every time the trap takes triggered, it takes a photo. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a bird in here, right there. When it's bigger, you can see. And so there's thousands and thousands of photos, and they ask people to look at the photo and is there a bird there or not. Click, is it a male or a female? Here's how you can tell. Click, how many are there? Click, what's it doing? Is it displaying? Or is it, it's really not hard, but it's also incredibly painstaking stuff that takes forever if it's like you and your postdoc in a lab somewhere. So they're finding all kinds of amazing things. Those birds are out there all the time. They didn't know they were. And the key is they're also engaging with local kids. So there's a bunch of schools in the area where these birds do their thing. And the kids never get out there because it's at the crack of dawn. Nobody wants to go out there that early in the morning. But now the kids are excited to go learn about their local birds. And so they let the kids go out and put the camera traps, and they collect some poop. It's got a word. It's not scat. I think it's got a special word. Bird poop. Bird scat poop. And they collect vegetation data. And so there is a way to do sort of the big crowdsourcing and the local engagement. But basically, if you have any camera trap data, if there's any way, you would need many, many photos classified. Zooniverse can help you do it. Eric, it's a graduate student who did this project, and he worked on the Zooniverse platform and uploaded everything without any trouble. And is analyzing the data for his dissertation and working with the kids and interviewing them, and that's a different chapter of his dissertation. I'm on his committee. So iNaturalist is another project that I know some people know about, where it's basically, they started out saying, it's a social media app for naturalists. But basically, it turns out that it's a gateway drug for anybody thinking of collecting data for science in the public. So all you have to do is take a picture of an organism and upload it. And then, because it's time-stamped and geolocated, there's evidence of that. And then the crowd of the iNaturalist community identifies the photo for you. So you don't have to know what it is. So people can feel like they're contributing without even knowing what it is. And I say to myself, how is that science learning exactly? And so we're studying that. But what I have seen is that kids get really excited about finding new things. Like they realize that if it's about finding new things to document them, then they get into the discovery mode, the exploring and discovery mode that is the beginning baby stages of science, right? So they kind of take on that attitude that they maybe didn't have before, or they see that discovery, exploring, turn over rocks and wade in the pool puddles is actually scientific in some ways, or can be. So iNaturalist is very easy now. It's gotten much better for you as a scientist to make a project. You draw a geographic boundary and you say, send me any photos that anyone submits of the organisms I care about in the place that I'm interested in. And so I know people, there's a herpetologist in Los Angeles who has his whole research project on just using the data from iNaturalist. And if it's local, he can then go investigate those places. But also, he uses global data too. The pisser about it, the problem with it is that it doesn't have effort reporting. So you don't know if someone went out there and looked for an hour and only saw one cool, pretty flower, or if that's just what they saw and they uploaded it because it was there and it was obvious. So that's it just shows you occurrence data. So, resources. Handbooks for scientists and managers. This is something that I wrote actually several years ago, but I think it's still quite valuable. So it's online for free, and it's basically a handbook for participatory monitoring for scientists and managers. So it's got like a lot of how-to and things to think about. I think that another article that might be useful is this one that I wrote. Jonathan Long is the first author, and it's basically thinking about these questions that won't go away in participatory action research. And so thinking about who is the community, when you say you're doing community-based work, who is that? What do you mean in terms of the volunteers or the participants that you're thinking about? Thinking about what are their expectations in participating in the project with you? What might they be looking for, as well as what you're hoping for? Thinking about accountability, thinking about if you're working especially with indigenous groups, who owns the knowledge? Thinking about how there's a lot about benefits and rewards, like if somebody's been participating with you for over a year, do they get something for it? Is there a party you could throw? Is there some kind of social reward that you can provide? And I'm going to keep moving here. So the sort of thinking about some approaches to involving the public, go to where your stakeholders are. Sometimes we think that because we're at the university that they will automatically want to come and work with us, but often you have to go there and show that you are earnest and honest and respectful of the kinds of work or the sort of their experiences and where they live. Communicate early and often, pilot and be prepared to adapt your protocols, and try to make sure you can return and give back results. Don't just come in, ask people to help collect data for you, and then leave. That's not participatory, that's just not. So one of the other things is we sort of identified these roles and functions that seem to be essential for doing citizen science and community science projects. You need someone to think about the coordination of the whole project. One person could fulfill all these roles, but it's really hard. You need someone to be thinking about the outreach and volunteer recruitment and coordination, that care and feeding of the volunteers. You need, if you imagine that you're going to have some kind of trainings for people to collect the data, you need to think about that, the education and support protocols. You want to think ahead of time very hard about the quality assurance and quality control procedures to make sure that the data is useful to you. You do want to think about data management. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm just going to have people collect a bunch of data, but they don't think about where that data can be housed and managed and kept track of and used and accessed. how the data analysis is going to work and whether you can have any way to show some of that, visualize some of that, either on the web or in paper posters like I did with the participants. Technology that you might need and use. And then think about the super volunteers. If you can get a few people that are really excited about the project, they can then help you do the project, right? They can be the ones that can help train new people. They can be the ones to maybe manage the data for you. There are a lot of people that are quite excited, and being a partner with a scientist, feeling like you're a partner and a collaborator with a scientific team is actually really cool to some people, cool and sexy to some people. So for centers, and thinking about institutions and what we think a center can do at UC Davis, and this is part of the big pitch that I gave to the campus. It was the Big Ideas competition, where they got faculty to pitch their big ideas to try to give them fodder to go get funding for the university. $50 million did not come my way, shockingly. But 50 or so faculty have joined the center in terms of saying that they are affiliates and they are wanting to participate in our events. And we say, I will read it. The vision of the center is new approaches for science and scientists collaborating with communities and individuals who engage in science to solve environmental problems as a part of civic life. We want this to be something that scientists just see as another tool in their toolbox, and members of the public see as just another thing that they can do with their free time. School. This is just a part of being a citizen, is to participate in science sometimes. So 21st century science needs to involve participation and collaboration for solutions. So we have these sort of 4 arms that I will talk about. Enhancing science. The goal is that community and citizen science can enhance science, improve science education, empower communities, and improve environmental management, all based, of course, on research. And that these 3 areas might look familiar to the faculty and researchers in the room, where these are the things that we're supposed to do. Sort of outreach and collaboration is the sort of service that often we have to think about. Education, teaching in classrooms, and research. So for enhancing science, the center activities, we want to help scientists. We are training scientists. I teach a class on participatory action research methods for graduate students in all kinds of disciplines across campus. There are about 15 to 20 students in the class each year, so I'm not hitting all 24,000, but okay, it's not that many, 12,000, but the idea of training on how to do participatory approach, how to think about power and social justice, and oftentimes white privilege and equity and things like that, but also just to think about what are some ways in the projects that you're working on that you could involve a few more people that might know the local situation better than you do. So training scientists and students in these methods, hosting conferences, having fellows come, having practitioners come, be fellows on campus, and hopefully bring in new faculty that are doing this kind of work. And we also, when we get money, which we don't have the money for the seed grants, but the idea of seed grants often really is a way to foster faculty and scientists at a university, right? If you get a little pilot project, you get just a little bit of money to do an edgy new project that normally wouldn't get funded, that is our goal, is we're trying to raise some money for the seed grants. To improve environmental management, we also have groups like the Forest Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Fish and Wildlife Service, and then also nonprofits like the Nature Conservancy, the National Park Service, that are all thinking they want to do some some kind of citizen science, some kind of participatory work on their lands or under their missions, and they need help. And so providing guidance and training for those people, having workshops that bring land managers together in areas where there are also communities and nonprofits that are interested in that place. So a lot of facilitating, a lot of this boundary work, right? Because as we've talked about, the interdisciplinary conversations are difficult. And providing evaluation of programs, moving to the science education, that's the thing that I'm actually, my research is in, so we've moved farther on this. So we offer teacher workshops. We offer professional development workshops to train teachers about how to plug in and adapt to these citizen science programs that are already out there, and the protocols and the curriculum are online, but we help them think about how to make it good science teaching. So that's the piece that we know from our research. We also are bringing citizen science into the training of the teachers in the first place, so the pre-service teachers as they're getting certified. And empowering communities. So we're working with community-based organizations and trying to, this is still beginning stages, but we have scientists at the university who want to do some community engagement but don't even know where to begin, but they have their area of research and their expertise. And we have community organizations or community groups that are in need of some help about water quality or air quality or mapping or biodiversity, something in their area, and we can try and match them. So we've done a little bit of this matchmaking, but we want to do some more. We need to make this more systematized. And so the idea is that we are trying to incorporate all these different facets of the university and bring those resources to bear to help to serve the public good, but also bring the public into the university and try to help them think about and sort of make that bridge. So that is the end. Oftentimes, you should start with the topics or ideas that are of interest to the people that you're trying to attract. So to say just the public is too general and broad. So think about the needs and interests of the people that you're trying to engage, and then think about how your science might be relevant to them, and that will help you attract people to participate. So if someone is concerned about a public health problem in their area, then they might want to help you do research on that. Or if someone is concerned about their children and the children's health, then they might want to do research on that. So starting with interests, if people have hobbies or fisher communities, depend on something as a resource, then they are more likely to help you do research on that. So it's very hard to attract people just broadly, generally.
So Heidi, my question, my curiosity was about the difference. You presented some results, and some studies that were focusing on youth, and some others in adults, And so I was thinking about how do you go about in deciding whether we use, whether it's a project that is more suitable to youth or to adults, but in two senses. The first one is it's because you need regarding citizen science. So usually we say that it's something that people volunteer in, but in the case of students and youth, it didn't seem to me that it's something very volunteer, because they go there and they have to go to school, they have to do, usually it's associated to schools. So I was thinking about, and when you think about adults, then you are thinking that, okay, they volunteer, so there is this characteristics is better. So it's suitable in case of when you are thinking about a project and it's difficult to have participants. So for instance, doing samples of water, contaminated water, I don't think adults will do that when in their leisure time. And I was thinking about that. No, so is that relevant or no when you decide a project if you go about with kids or not? And the second, then this. Do you want to do that one first, and then I can ask the second one, or do you think it's all together? They're together because one is in people participate, but if you want, I can stop. Yeah, the second is more. Okay, no, they are also because of youth and adults, but the second part is because of the outcome, no? And I was thinking about citizen science more in that idea, no, or that premise that you do citizen science to transform people, to transform society, no? And then, so if you want to do that, what is best? To use children, no, or youth, or adults? Because with children you can change, but that is like long-term thing. And with adults is in a sense, is volunteer, so are you really changing something? Is that possible? Or are you, we say here in Portuguese that you teach the mass to the priest. I don't know if they're saying in English, no? Yeah, so, or not. No, so these things, how do you decide between youth or not in the case of participation and then the outcomes if you want to transform society, no, not just get data.
Okay, those were very good questions. A couple of different things. Let's see. And thinking about the differences between youth and adults when you're thinking about who you want to. Well, there's a couple things you raised, actually. One is that it is a really important question that we grapple with about whether it is participatory when a student is required to do this for school, right? Like when they're required as part of, like their teacher tells them that it is their homework or that they will get a grade for it. We had those situations. And so if you are making claims that you are democratizing science by involving students, right, you're not. That's just not the kind of outcome that you're getting from working with kids. So in those cases, you will have hopefully data that you can use, and you will have students learning science, but all those sort of empowerment features that you might claim, that you think about when you talk about volunteering, they're not volunteering generally, right? Out of school projects, they are volunteering in some cases, right? If they decide to come and they decide to stay after school and do this because it's a part of a club, or if they come in the summer, sometimes that is voluntary. But the other thing you raised that's fun or hard is I struggled with that with my own dissertation research because the harvesters that I worked with made money per hour. Their time was money. And so if I was asking them to work with me for all day, every day for 5 days, it was impossible for them to do that without getting paid, right? So I got a fellowship, and I used the fellowship to pay the harvesters that were working with me. And that raises all sorts of flags about, well, then it wasn't participatory. Well, then they weren't working of their own free will, but they were because they could have been doing their regular job, right? But I think the idea of whether it's voluntary or not is an interesting thing. I don't use that as the definition, right? Most people do. I think that their time was valuable. We pay consultants for their time. They were consultants for me, so I paid them. But, so, I think that using the definition of volunteers as what you're deciding citizen and community science are is sometimes not how I would see it. But the other piece then about I think that it all boils down to what is the question that you're trying to ask in your project, what is the topic, and what is the science you're trying to do, and who would be interested in it, and what is the change you seek. Like if your goal is to if your goal is to have some change on the ground right now with respect to land use or habitat destruction or fishing or anything, then involve the adults in that project, because what you're trying to do is change what those adults are doing right now, right? But if your goal is more, I would like some data and I would like to engage the public and transform society in the long term, then you can work with children, right? I mean, that long term, because it is long term, you're playing the long game in that respect, right? So I think it just depends. I sometimes bristle when people just want to do this for outreach, and that is their only goal. I think that what we've seen with participants is that even for participants, it matters that it's really getting used. It matters that it's actually real science that is contributing to something, your research or some sort of other environmental or public problem. So to just do it as outreach and not actually need the data or want the data for anything, I think is sort of pulling a fast one on the participants even, right? If they're not. So that's how I'm just bringing it out there. I'm just saying it. Does that answer your question? Oh, the outcome. Yeah, I think it does.
Hi there. I'm Francisco. I'm a professor here at the Biology Institute. I have one comment and one question. Pretty easy. The comment is, citizen science, I guess that for us as a society, it's a difficult thing, because the volunteer work is not really into our society. For instance, volunteer work is not a valuable thing to get inside a university. It's not considered in CV as in the United States, for instance. And so I think I mean, the effort to get people involved in our culture will be a bigger effort. And actually, this is the comment. So, and the question is, if you have any examples of environmental problems that have been actually solved by citizen science, or that where citizen science was fundamentally useful for solving specific problems.
I'm not. So, all of the case studies that we had in the Marine and Coastal Citizen Science book, we chose because they had conservation outcomes, right? So, I think maybe environmental problems being solved is a tall order, a very grand goal. But to say that, say for example, the Queen Conch project, where they found evidence that the marine protected area was protecting the reef, they persisted that policy then, right? I mean, that helped the policy persist. Granted, it was already there, so that's a good thing. The climate change in mangroves, it was about carbon sequestration in mangroves, and so it was tourists and eco-tourists and local people involved in monitoring the mangroves. And so they, I believe, were able to use the Rede program and get carbon credits or get financial support for preserving the mangroves based on the data. So there's things like that. I think the marine litter is a little more longer term, right? And so those programs like documenting the plastic blobs, documenting plastics in the ocean is a longer term. That's not going to get solved anytime soon. The Coast project, the Dead Seabirds on the Beach project, they actually found one of the pieces of one of the data stories was they did find evidence that a particular kind of fishing gear in Puget Sound in Washington State was causing a lot of bycatch of killing certain seabirds, and so they got it was a little controversial, but they got the gear regulations changed. or that caused the GEAR regulations to be changed. They don't do advocacy, but they work with agencies. So, are those some examples? Okay. I got more, but I don't want to bore you. But it is one of those things, it's true, because, I mean, I think there's so much skepticism on different facets, like, is the data rigorous enough? Does conservation or do actions really change environmental problems really, all of those things? In many projects, yes, and in many projects, no, right? So it's all about the subtleties, I think.
Thank you so much for your excellent talk. I really enjoy. So you know that there is a lot of definition of citizen science. From your point of view, which is the best definition of citizen science? And what the main difference between citizen science and traditional science, regular science?
Thank you. Okay, well, the first question should supposedly be easy for me to answer, and yet, because that, I've tried to zero in on the definition that we use, right? There. So, but we have, we debated long and hard about whether citizen science should just be the contributory kind, or if it should be this wide spectrum. I maintain that when members of the public in some way collaborate with scientists, that is the definition that we're using. One of the pieces, though, is that it has to produce that new knowledge. It has to be, it needs to be knowledge or information that can be used by somebody. But of course, the entire field of useful science, like what constitutes useful science. A colleague of my executive director, Dr. Ryan Meyer, who Mark knows, says, you know what, half of science isn't useful. Like, we don't have evidence that a lot of science gets used. So how can that be your definition for citizen science? So the gray areas become a little sketchy. With the difference with traditional science, we wrote, let's see which article. Bonnie et al. Something. Bonnie et al. 2015, and we got asked to write a paper for in Science. So in Science magazine, which is really good because, as we've said, the impact factors rock on that. I mean, not that I'm counting, but yay! And so. I wonder how she translates that. Woohoo! And so in that, we talk about how we actually don't want it to be different from, we want citizen science and participatory science to just be considered another methodological approach to doing science. So, however, in my participatory action research class, we have a big table that shows the differences between traditional science and participatory action research, and it's about who makes decisions in the project, right? So these sort of more extreme forms of participation, if you're going to say that what you're doing is completely collaborative with community-based organizations, or for me, in some ways, it's all just sort of what you claim about what you're doing, right? Just be honest about what you're doing, right? And if you're making the decisions on the project, then don't call it participatory research, and that's okay. Call it citizen science. And so the sort of traditional research versus participatory research, I feel like there's a distinction, but we're sort of, if you include all of citizen science, then I see it as just a kind of another tool for traditional science. That was completely circuitous, I know.
You want to say something else?
No, I was just...
Okay, so now shows, yeah. And then I'm gonna stop for a while for 2 questions.
Heidi, yesterday I made a harsh critique on citizen science, and I want to specify it a little. But before that, first we have to be careful that we differentiate between action research, transdisciplinarity, and citizen science. Each of those has a unique selling point, and this has to be understood. And of course, participatory research is involved in all. Participatory research is involved in all three. I also can see that mutual learning, which is an important component of transdisciplinarity, may also be partly involved in citizen science, and also getting insight into complex problems, for instance, medical uptake in community, which is a scientific problem, can be done via this tool. However, I also acknowledge that the development of science literacy and to get insight into science, however, this should be done in a proper way. I come to this back later. The main point I can see, and you had a slide with empower people, and you put it away pretty fast. If you go to the discussion of post-normal scientists on citizen science, they claim in the book of Benison, Silvio Funtowitz, who is very, very well known in 2016, on Science on the Verge, published in Tempe, close to ASU, that citizens should define when science is good. And they also should judge what science should be done. What type of science should be done. And this is something which is in complete contradiction to the history of the university and the history of science. And I'm very, very skeptical and also sensitive against that. I give you just a brief example. When I've been 28, I have been a mathematician, and I hated number theory. I was thinking it's ridiculous whether we're at how many prime twins are around in the natural numbers. Then I went to AT&T, to Henry Pollack, and I talked about him about this. I said, do you know that the whole communication information system would not work if we would not have number theory? We apply that as a basic, and I have been so naive that I, at that time, could not understand the contribution for me, some ridiculous basic research about prime twins and triples. So this is, a naive person can never judge that. It's an inner science issue, and it has not been involved in your talk, but this is one sensitivity which is in the battlefield, also in the international battlefield. A second one has been touched also in the remarks before. Well, you said, well, the recreationists, they can do some data collection. They are human analog sensors in my talk. They are student assistants. They are cheap workers. They are perhaps also co-researchers. Well, now we have to be very, very careful on data collection. I'll give you another example. My first empirical study in 1985 on environmental science has been looked at a disease which is alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease, where you have coin-sized losses of bald hair. And you can also think about, well, why shouldn't the mothers check the head of the children? As it's pretty easy to see that. However, we also have trichotillomania, so we tear out, and we have other phenomena. If you talk to dermatologists, they can tell you how many variants of hair, of baldness spatial boldness exist. And if I would train someone from practice, a retired person, no scientific journal would accept that. And I think now I come to the questions. Are the jobs you are offering for co-research those scientific activities which are on the lower level, which can be, in the end, be much more better done by digital technologies, pattern recognition? They do much better on the picture. We have shown good pattern recognition does much better and cheaper, perhaps, than the retired person. And don't the people who participate get a wrong model of what science is doing? As they just look into something what is a fraction, and they don't see the complexity, and in the end everybody thinks he could become a ballerina. And it's absolutely, if you go to other professions, nobody would dare to participate and get someone so close into a scientist or a ballet dancer or a soccer trainer or something else. So there is a profession, and they have a very, very long education to go along with the boundary situations and the complexity which is around. This is my first question. And the second is a little, no, the second is related. What activities in science, in citizen science, are related to post-normal science? Is this also thinkable that traditional or normal science, in the Thomas Kuhnian sense, which I'm a normal scientist, would accept this participation? Or is it only as if everything what we are doing is a little fuzzy, as everything is so complex and we can't approach the truth anymore in a classical sense, that you open it for laypersons?
Hello, thank you. But I'm going to clarify the second question next. But first, one thing I can say, I think what you were asking about is the concern about with the dermatologist and the mothers looking at the disease on the head, that people can't actually, that there are some things that people can't discern, that people can't identify, that's data that they should just not be trying to collect because there's so many variations, as you said. Yes, right. So, and my answer, exactly, with bees, the bees is a really good example because the pollinator citizen science projects that I know of, I don't know your protocols yet, but there's bee citizen science projects like the Great Sunflower Project, where they do not ask, they have, and I have worked with a MacArthur genius, actually, on a citizen science pollinator monitoring project where the express goal of the project was first to figure out how taxonomically specific they can ask volunteers to be in their identification of bee groups. They had like just, can you tell the difference between a bee and a fly and a wasp? Which actually, there's a lot of mimics, right? So that's hard sometimes. So that's the like grossest level of discerning, and then they went from there and got people sort of large bee groups like honeybees versus everything else. And they asked people to identify those. And then they went to, of the everything else, bumblebees. I have no idea if these common names will translate, but big, fat, shiny black bees are carpenter bees, right? And furry, cute, iconic, stripy bees like bumblebees, like big groups, right? And they looked at and they compared their citizen science data, collected data, observational data, to pan trapping and netting of those same transects at the same time by PhD graduate students, right? And compared and looked at when did people stop being accurate in their data. and they stopped being accurate at the big bee groups, right? The like people could get bumblebees, people could get honeybees, and they could get big fat black shiny carpenter bees. And right? So they could measure, they were accurate about abundance and they were accurate about diversity to those groups. And so then the question was, is that data even useful for her research, right? And it turns out yes, because she's looking at pollination services in the Central Valley of California, and it matters because native bees, honeybees are in collapse, and native bees actually provide pollination services, but pesticides and different kinds of farming practices are ruining their ground nesting habitat. And so if we can see just what the abundance is of honeybees versus all the other bees, that is useful data. So maybe they shouldn't be able, they can't, and apparently the lore is there's 3 people in the United States alive that can identify bees to species. That's it. Everyone else is guessing, right? And so that's so we can't expect, so that's I love that. That's a long story, but I do love that example. So, and then the next answer is also, the pattern recognition by computers. I should just say that that's something that a lot of people are using. In fact, who's the bat person? Somebody studies bats. Maybe bat person's not. Bats! So there's a project called Bat Detective where people actually recognize the calls. It's all like a mother calling its babies, the baby calling its mother, males. Sometimes it's about different species you can recognize, and she's using people's recognition of those calls to then train the machine. She's using machine learning to eventually, she's getting to where she won't need people anymore because the computer will be able to recognize the patterns in the calls. But for first stage, she's using crowdsourcing to have people identify those calls. So I think there are a lot of scientists that are using the machine learning. And Zooniverse, they stop having people collect do the crowdsourcing and things like clicking on the photos and classifying them. When they run out of photos, they close the project. And that's something that people are like, no, why did you close the project? I love it. And they're like, we're not gonna waste people's time. We have answered the question that we wanted to answer, and it is done. So I respect that. And no, I don't remember the last question. I tried to write it down, but it didn't work.
Wrong science model has been one issue, and then there is to post whether science in the end, if you go into not only data collection, but in participation, is strongly linked to the post-normal science concept.
If you had to explain to a layperson what the post-normal science concept is, what would you say?
The post-normal science concept got developed by Ravitz and Funtowitz, and they acknowledged that the problems we are facing are so overly complex and interwoven that the traditional aspiration of science to approach truth, to get a more realistic description of the reality has to be given up. And that science is only one voice among others. And they forget about that practitioners have a very selective and interest-driven perception and reward system, whereas the science system has a different reward system, which is just to get a validated, better understanding of reality, which is in some respect independent of the social values.
That's the claim, though, right? Mark showed us that sometimes science is driven by grant funding and publication, corporate bad things. But that's an interesting point. So I think that I lost my thought after the point about the evil journals. One point that I got from what you were saying is that people were just seeing a fraction of the science process. Is that also part of the same point?
No, the question is how much is that related, that citizens can go in and make judgments about quality of research and whether research should be continued or not, because this old ideal model has to be given up as a kind of benchmark.
So I can say that that is something that we talk about a lot in my participatory action research class, and also with, and I remember now something that helps answer this question. There has been some research, not a lot, but some social science research done with scientists who run citizen science projects, like Julia, who runs the Dead Seabird Project, and many others. And they do talk about how their own questions, they have changed the way they do their own science, right? That having people involved has given them new perspectives on the kinds of questions that are important to answer and things like that. As well, I didn't touch anything, I swear to God. Okay, and so I think that there is, to some extent, and also in participatory research, we talk about how it involves giving up some of the power of the decision-making in the scientific process. And so, to some extent, it definitely does not say that you're letting go of rigor, you're letting go of reliability and validity and all these things. It's that it's just affecting and shaping perhaps the questions that you think are important and perhaps the ways that you answer them. But it is, to some extent, a little bit about letting go. Some scientists don't want to do that. But yeah. So maybe, is that okay? You had some questions also. Written ones?
Yes, I'm going to go for... eu vou fazer agora duas perguntas. Can you put your here? It's in Portuguese, so... Oh, no, yeah, I have to change... Eu vou fazer duas perguntas aqui, vou fazer a primeira, depois a segunda, né, separado para... São essas escritas. A primeira é de estudante de pós-graduação, não colocou o nome, e tem duas perguntas. Né? A primeira é, você acredita que a ciência cidadã pode se tornar um campo disciplinar ou uma disciplina? Né? E a segunda... essa é um pouco mais comprida, então eu já tinha lido, mas as recomendações para a prática da ciência cidadã são imperativas, né, importantes, mas com pouco direcionamento analítico e com pouca, talvez, clareza sobre subsídios teóricos que fundamentam as escolhas e alinhamento epistemológico dos projetos. Como você vê essa situação? Ou ainda... Quais subsídios teóricos você atribui a esta prática? Do you want me to read it again? Because I know it's not crystal clear. Yeah, okay. And then I will read it again. Okay.
Okay. So it's a very interesting question about whether citizen science and community science should be a disciplinary field, or not. It turns out many people think yes, and so there is an association for that. So that's why I put this information up here, because I wanted to make sure you knew if you were interested in this, if you were interested in the debate and critique, or if you're interested in learning how to do it and tools and resources. The Citizen Science Association is got 4,000 members now globally. It's primarily in the United States, but there are many people in Europe and Asia. Australia has a Citizen Science Association as well, the Australian Citizen Science Association. And the European Citizen Science Association also has thousands of members, I believe. And it's basically been sort of blessed. I don't know how it works in Europe, but it's more top-down than the Citizen Science Association based in the US, because it is actually coming through and approved by the European Commission, and so governments can start to, are working to make volunteer monitoring citizen science a part of how they collect environmental data nationally. So that's very exciting. And so to the question about whether therefore then is it a field, the question is, I don't, or it's a field versus a discipline, right? I mean, I don't think it's a discipline. I could not tell you right now. Y'all who study this could tell me the definition of a discipline, but I'm pretty sure this is not it. But as a field, there are many, many people that are trying to discuss the methods and approaches that seem to work, the outcomes that come out for participants and for the questions, the environmental problems or other problems that are being investigated. So we did decide to make a journal. And so if anybody is interested, we made a journal. It is open access. It is fairly costly to publish in it as an author, but we are very dedicated to the idea that you should only pay if you can, and so there's a sliding scale for publication fees. It's called Citizen Science Theory and Practice, and we have various kinds of articles that you can submit. Some are more about project specific, and others are the kind of research that I do, which is looking across many projects at features or strategies or factors or outcomes across many citizen science or community science projects. And I'm glad, I know there's not so many people here now, but I'm glad for any of you, if you are interested in potentially seeing if you can publish an article, to look at an abstract, bless you, look at an abstract, give you feedback on the abstract to submit to the journal. So it's not a discipline. It is very multidisciplinary. Some might argue interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, but it is not a field. I mean, I'm sorry, it's not a discipline. What was the second question?
I will try to explain what I understood. One part I didn't understand, I'm the second part. But I think it's like the recommendations from citizen science are very important. But this is a position, no? Like there's little theory, no, or analytical. It's not very theoretically based or very analytically based. Or see, it's not. In many studies are not based on really any theory, no, that can help you choose, no, what you have to do or not. Like I think it's something that I also find in many articles of citizen science, that you have really a description of the outcomes or okay, in this project, if you do that, if you like involve people in blah, 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 that helps. But in a sense, it seems much really context specific and not really why people do that or what is like the theory behind why people volunteer or the good outcomes or this kind of thing. I think it's more or less in that direction.
Thanks. I can answer that. Again, that's probably why it's not a discipline, because there is no theory. Some people have tried to write an article basically on developing a theory of citizen science, which I don't like. But hey, it's out there. Basically, most of us agree that it is about applying other, theories from actual disciplines, whatever discipline you're in, to the approach, right? To the tool or the approach of citizen science, community science. For me, I apply learning theory, right? All that stuff that I talked about, identity and agency, those are theories of learning that I applied. Legitimate peripheral participation, communities of practice, situated learning theory, all those things are things that I apply from my field to the participation and why we might think these particular activities would lead to learning, right? That's that's what I do. But there's other people, there's lots of people that have, that are in environmental psychology and look at motivation theory, and that are looking at, people are very excited to look at why do people do this kind of volunteering usually, right, versus other kinds of environmental volunteering. And they use intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and they look at those, right, they use motivation theory. So it's true, lots of people, I mean, I have written that the field or area of citizen science is under-theorized, right? And so we're working on it as far as, that's basically and there's lots of conservation biologists that are looking at it with, thinking about conservation practice and, right? It's a very practical field in its essence. And so that's what I can say about that.
There is another written question here, but I think it's a very good one. And it's in English. The name is Carlos Lopez Ortiz. Is a postgraduate student. It's over there. Okay. Good afternoon. Congratulations. My question is the following. How to sustain citizen participation in developing countries where time worked means money for survival? And if these public actors leave and enter the project, how do you work with the continuous training of new actors? So if you... So, and if these public actors, the guys that participate, leave and enter the project because it's difficult to get in the project, how do you work with the continuous training of new actors? So is that, I think it's feasible, if you have experience on how to do that?
So the first question is a good one, and I talked with Luisa about it. I think she left. But the first question was about, in the context of people that are poor, people that have to work for a living and do not have time to volunteer. The thing that she brought up was she's studying amphibians who only come out at night, and it's not very safe to go out at night and look in dark places for frogs when in many places, right? Many urban areas especially. And so how can she asked, how can I do this? But the question about volunteering versus getting paid is kind of what we're talking about. And I think, Francisco, you were saying, no, it was Antoine who had to leave, I think also, but he was saying that they paid fishermen to participate in the participatory monitoring here in the Bay from different villages. And so, like, the question is, can you only do citizen science or participatory science if you can pay people, right? And in some cases that may be true, but that actually is how a lot of participatory research projects decide if it's going to work or not, is if people are inherently interested in the outcomes of the research, right? The ideas of participatory research are that you are asking and answering a question that the community actually cares about, and they really want to know the answer. And so they do, that's where Paulo Freire and popular education comes from, began with, or we draw on that in thinking about, it's asking questions about your condition, your situation, and trying to get more information about that, right? So in some cases, it may only be that you can do this work when it's something people do inherently care about. The way that I work with graduate students is if they have not already got a research question handed down to them from their advisors, right, their professors, then perhaps if they have an area of research and you know that there's a community that might be interested in that area, but you haven't specified the question, you can go and ask and talk to people and find out if they have, what questions they ask that might fit with what you are interested in. So it's very iterative and slow and takes time and doesn't get rewarded with publications right away, but that's one way that this happens in developing countries a lot, I know. So that's And the answer about frogs and safety at night, man, we're still working on that. We were thinking about calls, having the calls recorded. People could record the calls. It's a thing. And the second question was that the second question? Yeah, it's good enough. Good enough. Okay.
Alô? Eu vou falar em português. Tá. Boa tarde, meu nome é Ricardo. Eu sou estudante da pós-graduação no Instituto de Saúde Coletiva e faço uma pesquisa junto com a Fiocruz também e em um projeto que envolve também a Universidade de Liverpool. Então, nós estudamos aqui risco objetivo para leptospiras e coletamos... Posso continuar? A senhora fala. Ok. E coletamos, avaliamos soropositividade para leptospira em humanos, coletamos ratos, então, e também observamos abundância e positividade em ratos. E um dos nossos desafios na minha pesquisa é agora comparar, associar risco objetivo com risco percebido dos moradores, que aí eu acho que ficou bem, assim, no que está sendo debatido agora à tarde, o que o professor colocou, né? E esse debate está dentro lá do grupo, porque nós temos uma equipe social, uma equipe de epidemiologistas, eu sou veterinário, mas trabalho com sistema de informação geográfica, então tem toda essa mistura lá, e isso está aparecendo lá. Então, queria agradecer a vocês que estão contribuindo bastante e respondeu algumas perguntas e surgiram algumas dúvidas novas. Então, eu vou falar um pouquinho do que é o trabalho, tentar ser breve. Então, em uma das nossas áreas de estudo, que nós já temos alguns resultados, que nós trabalhamos com jovens também, de 2 bairros, inicialmente, agora com piloto. Vamos chegar a 100 jovens até o fim do ano. Estamos com 20. E eles apontaram a área em um mapa web, gratuito e aberto, né? Eles apontaram áreas que eles consideram de risco à saúde e ao ambiente. E nós estamos comparando com o nosso risco objetivo. E essas manchas estão, os hot points, né, os pontos quentes estão ficando próximos. É claro que ainda teremos mais a avaliar até o fim do ano. E o que nos chamou a atenção também, que eles apontaram áreas fora da nossa área de estudo, que são áreas em que o governo do Estado vai fazer uma intervenção sanitária. Então, consideramos já como um resultado preliminar interessante, né, que o risco percebido por eles está indicando áreas além do nosso projeto. E nós fomos visitar essas áreas e realmente elas são áreas precárias. Outra questão interessante é que pedimos para eles indicarem pontos no bairro em que eles evitem e dissessem o porquê. E o maior fator de evitar alguns pontos no bairro foi indicado como violência, 80%. Então, a violência apareceu nessa outra pergunta. E o overlap, sobreposição, né, das camadas de violência com risco à saúde e ambiente, que estavam muito relacionadas a risco à saúde e ambiente, esgoto, lixo, né? Então, agora, aí vamos utilizar técnicas, porque estávamos a perguntar que técnicas vamos utilizar, né? Técnicas em sistema de informação geográfica para interpolar esses gradientes de pontos e riscos apontados pelos jovens até o fim do ano. E como esperamos que ocorram gradientes entre risco objetivo e percebido que possam se sobrepor, né? A minha pergunta, né, lendo alguns artigos, nós ficamos em dúvida se utilizamos mapeamento participativo, participatory mapping, ou mapeamento colaborativo. Eu achei muito bom esse sequenciamento que vocês apresentaram, co-criação, co-create. Eu acho que nós chegaremos até a etapa de co-create, de co-criação, no momento em que nós planejamos, após o período político, nós vamos levar esses jovens na Câmara de Vereadores, vamos levar eles... eles já perguntamos, como vocês querem apresentar o trabalho de vocês? Eles, eu quero apresentar de porta em porta, eles falaram, né? Porque se fizermos um evento, eu acho que não vão, porque não vão entender, e a gente quer apresentar o nosso trabalho. E eles se apresentavam na comunidade, o nome do projeto é Jovens na UFBA. Aí eles se apresentavam, sou um jovem da UFBA. Ficou... Então, essa questão da identidade foi forte, e trazendo eles para a UFBA também, eles se sentiram como parte, né? Então, a dúvida... E queremos, então, chegar a essa outra etapa, fortaleceu essa ideia na gente, a gente vai chegar mesmo a essa outra etapa, para ser uma cocriação e que eles se apropriem. Mas, então, a minha pergunta seria, o que seria mais apropriado para categorizar esse nosso estudo, né? Mapeamento colaborativo ou participativo?
Can I add? He was talking to me before. They have this study involves like taking pictures of the different places with all the students, and they have something that he didn't say that I thought was really interesting, because they asked for help, but they are giving something in return. So they are teaching the students how to upload and like informatics and things like that. So it's like two-way, project. They asked for something, but I said, okay, if you will help us with this, we are going to give you something else, And they are also going to present the results and things like that. So he thought it was very similar to the Citizen Science project and wanted to talk about.
That is so fantastic. So a couple of things to think about is if you look up, I don't know if you have seen literature on youth participatory action research. It's YPAR. It's the idea of youth doing research with scientists together, but the youth have quite a bit of say. It's the opposite of the teacher forcing the youth to do the project, right? So you are talking about, I think you are talking about youth participatory action research, and so it also sounds like you're talking about, I would say, I think collaborative mapping, not participatory mapping, because participatory mapping is a little bit more top-down, and you are really, it sounds like what you say is that the observations, the perceived risk from the youth is comparable, possibly enhanced, or better, no, not better, but it is comparable to the data of the observed risk, right? And so that potentially means that you could trust those, you could perhaps not have to go out and collect so much data on the observed risk if the perceived risk can tell you what you need to know, right? So that becomes like, that is great. And one of the things, the fact that you have the give and take, that you are providing them with skills and training with computers and things like that. In the case of the question of what do you do when people are in poverty, one of the things is you can give them skills. Sometimes it doesn't take money. Sometimes, and certainly the cachet and prestige of being associated with the university is also something we talk about a lot in participatory research, where you are giving people power and voice just by working with them, as long as you're not actually domineering and authoritative, right? As long as they are, but they are clearly, and the fact that you can say that their observations of their place are just as valid as these fancy data that you've collected, like that will make every difference for them. So I think that is what I have to say. Is there more? Did you have a question more than that? It's just really awesome. So you should publish the heck out of that.
ou três? É o chave ou não?
Thank you and congratulations for your really nice talk. I like concepts. I think that they are very important. And even for citizen science, we know that must be based in regular science in some level. For taxonomy, as an example, we have a level that we can use the information. Depends on the goals that you want, like if you wish monitoring, see the presence or absence of insects, try to map distributions. In this case, work very well. And sometimes, if we have nice data collecting, like photos and videos, it's easier. We get nice data for including revisions or, if possible, training people to collect the insect even better. But maybe we could say that citizen science could be a way or a tool for we integrate regular science for a specific goal, like understanding, get people engaged, understand better the environment, try to establish conservation, maybe, yes. Not a discipline, but a real tool to make the connections with the basic or regular science with the people.
It's an interesting point. I have a colleague, I think she just published, Parrish, Julia Parrish, Parrish et al., and it just came out, and I think it actually gets to that point because she and colleagues definitely want to make that distinction about rigorous citizen science from citizen science that might just have educational goals, which I kind of don't want to call it citizen science then. But, so there's debates. It's all terminology debates, right? But one of the way this applies to maybe what you are thinking is the idea of a nested project, right? Or a project with components. So there may be a question that you're asking that citizen science volunteers or participants could help you collect some of that data, and there would be a lot of engagement, and maybe you can't really answer the question very well with just that data, but that you add a layer of your more rigorous data collection to that, and then there's a story, right? Then there's an answer. So I think that's what a lot of people do. And so to see it as a component, but is still useful for the outreach and education of, scientific literacy and stuff. There was something else I was going to say. Yeah.
So I have been provoked that question on the theory, and I was thinking that there is some this analogy between citizen science and regular science that we might explore to understand more about citizen science, that to be a scientist means to master theories and methods in the given field by enculturation in a scientific community. And so from this perspective, we can say, how could be a citizen science if these citizens, they would not be enculturated in a scientific community, they would not master theories and master the methods. Then I had three thoughts about this, and I would like to share with you and see your opinion. One is that how could we demand these from citizen scientists if sometimes our students in scientific training, they don't master the theories and methods either? So what can we learn from this problem? Because sometimes a researcher gets a student, an undergrad student, and he's there in the lab, but he doesn't grasp the whole process, how the hypothesis was created, what theory is behind, how the methods were deployed. And so there is some similarity that might learn from this problem from our training of scientists.
But even going further, some scientists are very successful as scientists in the world of publications and citations and so forth, and they don't master sciences. Perhaps they master methods. For instance, one guy in Brazil, whose name I will not say, he's a leader for something called, well, I will not say either, but like a pseudoscience. So it's like a pseudoscience. And this guy comes and says, look, science is about unfair and completely unbiased evaluation of data. And so he has no clue. He published 350 papers, and he's top researchers in Brazil. But he mastered a method. If you look at the papers, he masters a method. He's very good at one method. So this made his career. So if we demand that a citizen science master theories and methods and so forth, what we do with this guy? So I think if we learn into science, we see that there is some space to think about that maybe some problems we see in citizen science we might see in ourselves. That was the first thought. Second thought was, maybe citizen science is something altogether different from regular science and has a lot of epistemic dependence, using a concept from Hans' work. Like in interdisciplinary research, a scientist has epistemic dependence on some other scientists, and citizen science has some kind of epistemic dependence on the researchers who are working in that field. So we have to understand more about that. I think this opens a research question, what kind of epistemic dependence is going on there and what follows from this. Second thought. Third thought was, not a problem for citizen science, for participatory research in general. We should find a way of giving access to the people who are collaborating with us, to the theories and methods. How to do that can be very difficult. For instance, I work with teachers in community of practice, so I do participatory research with teachers. I benefit a lot from their knowledge. I try to make them benefit from our knowledge, but our knowledge is incredibly demanding. They can enculturate in educational research to get all the theories and methods. So what can we do? So I think there is a question there. How to make these accessible for people who will not have to learn all the things. And I think, again, the literature on interdisciplinarity can give us some ideas of how you get a geologist to work with biologists, but your geologist not turn into a biologist. How I do this with a teacher, a citizen, a high school student. So I think more than classifying things and asking, oh, this is not science, or what we can learn from this to make science better and make our connection to other stakeholders better too, I think.
So those are all good points. I think there was one question about how to help the participants, in your case, the teachers, that's who I work with too, to get a little bit of the theory maybe, right? I mean, because that's the reality. I also, the project that I'm doing with the Natural History Museums, they are scientists that are running lots of different citizen science projects, and they are my practitioner collaborators, and they don't know anything about education theory, right? But being a part of this project, the goal is for them to learn a bit more, right? I mean, they want to learn more, and sometimes I go off and I'm designing my methods and I forget that they want to know why we're doing it this way, right? So I've been doing little webinars with them, right? Because they're in the UK, but there are other versions of that where I give them a little briefing about what we know about learning theory and talk about that. So the other thing is the research briefs, right? The idea of writing a digestible, small, two-sided brief that describes a little bit of the theory, describes a little bit of your research findings if you can. They found those very useful, right? To be able to, and case studies, like case studies are very concrete, right? They're very tangible, and if you can weave some theory into the story about one project or one classroom or one group of people that have done this thing, then it's much more sort of accessible. And all the other stuff you said was great. Did you have a second question? Okay, that was good. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you for making this so funny and nice. Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm not used to the literature, so and I may have missed something in the talk, but I have the impression that the term citizen science, because of the science in the citizen science, is focused as outcome on making people closer to science. And then I was thinking, some research we have been doing in my lab have shown that in the Amazon or here in the Atlantic forest, one thing that drives or influences what smallholders, rural landowners feel or perceive or value from nature is strongly related to their experience with nature. So their services, how they, if they visit the forest, if they know the forest, if they use the forest, if they receive services from the forest, whatever. And then I'm saying, in all this, this part that is changing values about nature is just a side effect, because it has nothing to do with science itself. But if you go out to try to identify bees, and you go out in the nature, you may somehow change something that has nothing to do with science, but the connection with nature. And is this just considered a side effect, or what? Because I think it could be very, very important.
It's a good side effect. Yeah, some of the stuff that I didn't get to talk about, there's a lot in environmental education research about place. And there's all, right, in psychology about connection to and geography. Place identity, place ownership, place other things. And so one of the things that gets talked about a lot in research like mine, environmental education research, is that citizen science supports or encourages or facilitates people's connection to place, which then we know from research has reflected on it reflects their commitment to that place and their taking action and changing their behaviors about that place, right? So you go out and you look at the bees every day, you start to see lots of things, you get protective of that place, right? We actually did an article in the special issue, just FYI, there's a special issue in Biological Conservation Journal on citizen science that if you're interested, there's a lot of different articles that might be useful, and one of them is about place, and that we looked at 3 different databases of citizen science projects that, and we scored them for natural resource management outcomes and changes in natural resource management, and the extent to which they seem to connect people to place using these different attributes of place. And we found that there was definitely, across the board, the more aspects of the project that encouraged connection to place led to more natural resource management actions and outcomes. So, yes, that.
Okay, we are 4 minutes late, and I think we don't have any more questions. Yeah, so thank you very much, Heidi, for your contribution, and really insightful. No, I'm speaking in English. You shouldn't need. I know, but I was like, is that so bad? You want to hear in Portuguese? I'll translate English into English. I'm not going to sleep this evening. Okay, no, thank you very much and for your insightful, and I'm sorry for my bad English. And eu agradeço todos que ficaram até agora, né, a presença. E, bem, amanhã a gente tem de novo de manhã e começa às 8h30, de novo, certo? 8h45. 8h15? Só para eu acho que... Amanhã 8h15. Então, amanhã às 8h15 a gente começa novamente. Muito obrigada, gente. Tchau, tchau.
Obrigada.